Hi, this is Jennifer Newton with Walters Home Management in San Diego, California, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about what to do if a tenant stops paying rent. Sometimes it happens. A tenant doesn't pay their rent on time. Many rental property owners aren't sure how to handle a delinquent tenant. Some owners hold a hard line and immediately start posting notices, while others have a more difficult time being firm about collecting the rent, and then end up a few months later wondering, now what do I do? Here's a few things to consider if you find yourself with a tenant who's more than a few days late with the rent. First and foremost, communication is key. Contact your tenant to find out why the rent is late. I recommend telephone communication rather than text or email. A personal conversation always goes a long way towards finding out what's really going on, and it's more difficult to evade questions when you're speaking to someone in person, and you really want to hear what's going on when you have a delinquent tenant. Find out what's causing the delay. Is it an isolated situation, or is it going to be ongoing? If so, that will help you decide on a plan of action for the situation where it's ongoing. Have they been a long-term tenant with an otherwise on-time payment pattern? If so, it's okay to be flexible. But it's important to get a firm date when they can pay the rent, and I don't recommend going beyond 2 weeks. Are they willing or able to make a substantial partial payment? If the answer is no, that's a red flag. If you found yourself in a critical situation and your tenant is now a month behind in rent, consider running a current credit report to find out if they're behind in their other obligations as well. But remember, it's really important that your lease agreement and the application that the tenant signed give you permission to run a credit report during the tenancy. So make sure to check for that before running a credit report. You can suggest they borrow from a family member, particularly if they say, I won't get paid for 7 more days, but then I can pay the rent. A family member is more likely to lend them the money and get repaid rather than you, the landlord, waiting for payment. In any of these scenarios, you should always start the process of dealing with a delinquent tenant by posting a 3-day notice to pay or quit. First, it will shorten the waiting period if ultimately you have to file an eviction. But it also sends a clear and formal message to the tenant. It says, you haven't paid your rent, and it's due, and you need to pay it now. I get calls several times throughout the year from owners who are managing their own properties who have a tenant that's now 1, 2, sometimes even 3 months behind in their rent. Unfortunately, a tenant who is 2 months behind or more is not likely to get caught up, and an owner is typically looking at an eviction at that point. It just becomes too overwhelming for them to think about coming up with all of that money, as well as dealing with whatever the stress is that's going on in their life, keeping them from paying their rent. Here's a couple of suggestions, though, if you find yourself in that situation. If they're in a lease, offer to let them out. And if they move within 3 weeks, everybody's happy. Another option is pay them to move. Now, I get a lot of raised eyebrows when I suggest that, but when you think about it, it ends up being less expensive. If you give the tenant an incentive to move, you will eliminate having to pay for an eviction, which can be $800 to $1,200, plus non-payment of rent while you're going through the eviction process. So that's a real good remedy to consider if you find yourself with a tenant that's more than a month behind in their rent. At Walters Home Management, our experience has been positive when we rely on an open exchange of communication with tenants. We exercise discretion and compassion when appropriate. You'll get a much better result in the long run. Non-paying tenants is a stressful situation for any landlord. If you find yourself in a difficult situation, give me a call. I can help walk you through the options, help you determine a course of action, and hopefully give you a little peace of mind.